Guys, late swapping used to be pretty much optional in DFS and especially NBA DFS. But here in 2021, as games are continuing to get harder, it is a requirement if you want to profit in 2021. There are a lot of pretty solid projection systems out there now. Everybody has a sense of how to use an optimizer to build optimal lineups. And as we've talked about in some of our other videos, in a sport where correlation factors are a little bit lower and ownership in chalk is actually generally pretty good and a lot of times condenses around the best plays, late swap in NBA DFS is the single biggest edge you are going to get. At a bare minimum, you've got to swap players that aren't playing basketball at all that night out of your lineups, but late swap goes way beyond that. And if you're only late swapping because somebody is out, or if you're not late swapping at all, you are leaving a ton of money on the table. This used to be a really time-consuming and frankly frustrating thing to have to do, but I'm going to lay it all out for you today, how to late swap as quickly and efficiently and effectively and profitably as possible for your NBA DFS lineups. Now, before we really get into anything here, we do these shows live for a reason. I want to answer questions that you guys have. So as I'm walking through this stuff here today, if you have any questions for me, throw it into YouTube chat or throw it into the Office Hours channel on Slack, and I'd be happy to help answer questions. But first off, let's kind of talk about, what is late swap. So for those of you that maybe don't know, in NBA DFS, players are only going to lock into their lineups when their individual games start. So you can swap players in or out of the lineup up until the time their individual games start. The reason this is important, first of all, is unless you are happy getting zeros in your lineups, right? The most important kind of late swapping in DFS is to remove players that have been ruled out of your lineups to avoid the zero. This is players, that are questionable going into lock, and then it turns out that they aren't going to play, or players that are just surprise scratched, which happens fairly frequently in NBA DFS, right? The most important and the first reason why we're doing late swap for NBA is to get these players out of our lineups. But secondly, and probably more importantly, late swap is important in NBA DFS because players getting ruled out from games create salary inefficiencies in the rest of the players on the team. So first of all, if a player isn't going to play, his backup is probably now pretty underpriced, the guy that is going into the starting role. But not even necessarily just the backup. That player that got ruled out will typically have usage stats and rebounding rates or assist rates, or it was going to do things on the basketball court. And all that usage needs to go somewhere. And it goes typically to a lot of other players on the team. A lot of times a starter getting ruled out or a big name player getting ruled out creates salary inefficiencies on the entire rest of the team. This kind of late swapping is valuable no matter what, whether you have the players that got ruled out in your lineup or don't. The salaries and the best plays on the slate have changed dramatically because this news has broken, right? This is really absolutely crucial. And this is what makes late swapping, I would say, pretty much mandatory every single time you play NBA DFS. I don't think you can afford to play an NBA slate if you are not going to be around to late swap, or if you're going to choose not to late swap when news breaks. And I also think you are sacrificing a ton of edge if you just decide not to late swap when news breaks. So it's crucial. The main reason why this provides a ton of edge, this provides a ton of edge just because you make the projection of a lineup go up, right? You are finding better value opportunities in the lineup. The lineup overall gets stronger. But the reason why I say that this is the biggest edge in DFS or NBA DFS is because a lot of people aren't really bothering to do this, or they're not doing it very well. So for NBA in particular, though, I think the edge that you get here is exaggerated for a couple different reasons. And the first one is that NBA games don't all start at the same time. So there's a ton of different game start times, and also teams don't typically release their starting lineups very early. So we typically won't know who's even going to start for a lot of teams on an NBA slate for every single team playing until after lock, and sometimes maybe only 15 to 20 minutes before the game starts, maybe even less. But also NBA in particular is lower variance. So players are more likely to hit their average projections. Average projections are fairly predictive compared to a sport like baseball or football. And what that means is backups that are thrown into the starting roles are not only good plays, not only grading out good point per dollar plays, they could very easily become must plays, right? And failing to late swap and take advantage of these mispriced players leaves a lot of money on the table. And again, most of these people, or a lot of people in your contests, and at the lower stakes even more, are not even going to bother trying to do this. There was actually an interesting discussion in Slack recently here as well, talking about what percentage of players are late swapping. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's anywhere from 5 to 25% at the low to medium stakes of people that are actually reacting to news. Some of these must plays that open up in your contests as the slate goes on will be way under-owned. You're going to get a much more relative advantage late swapping and getting exposure to players that should be higher owned and aren't because they became good plays after lock than you are going to be pouring over ownership projections and trying to figure out the perfect way to play the game theory of ownership before lock, right? So let's talk about why, or let's talk, not why, let's talk about what the optimal way of late swapping in NBA is, right? Or the ideal way you would late swap. So news comes out and a starting lineup comes out that maybe has a player starting that wasn't expected, or some star players out. Maybe LeBron James is resting or something like that for the Lakers, right? So the very first thing that needs to happen is you need to have updated projections that reflect that entire new game state. So you've got LeBron's 32 or 33 minutes that need to get projected somewhere else. You've got all of that player's usage in terms of their shots and assist and rebounding rates. All of that needs to get to the right players on the team. And then that all comes together and creates new projections for the players playing in the game, right? But if you've seen our other NBA DFS videos or our other NBA videos in general, you know that for GPPs, it's not just about average projection, right? We need upside. So thinking about upside and how we're building lineups with upside, the next step is to think about how the player's correlations have changed, right? If a player is now suddenly in the starting lineup, that player is going to have different correlations, positive or negative, to the other players in the starting lineup, the players coming off the bench, the players playing on the other teams, right? But even more so, we also now need to start thinking about how the game script has changed. If LeBron's not going to play for the Lakers, the other team's probably going to have a much better shot to win the game or keep the game close. The game script overall has changed. And if you watched our video yesterday called How Our NBA Simulator Works, you know how important these game scripts are for NBA and actually finding upside and projecting the outcomes of games. If you didn't watch that video, it's up on our YouTube channel. Highly recommend checking that out. But the game scripts changed pretty significantly when a player has been ruled out or a starting lineup has changed, and that has an impact on upside. So we need to think about how have the correlations of players changed? How has the game script overall for the game now changed? And what do the new ranges of outcomes look like for players? What is the upside of the new players that are in the starting lineup? Has the upside of other players on the team gone down now that the team maybe has a less chance of winning the game, has a lower chance of winning the game, right? There's a lot that can happen here overall when news breaks in NBA. And this is really only on the projecting side. Once you've gone through and you've projected all the new players, you have a good sense of what plays have upside, what the new correlations look like for certain players on the teams. Now you are theoretically ready to swap your lineups, right? When you do these swaps, you need to make sure that you are accounting for the new projections, but also the new correlations, the game scripts, and the upside of players. On a traditional optimizer or some of the other tools that are out there, this would probably look like setting a bunch of new player grouping rules to try to force negative correlations or avoid negative correlations. And it would also probably require you to maybe reset min and max exposures that you have pre-built, or apply new ownership rules or project new ownership. All these things to try to get the right players back into your lineups at the right exposure and avoid negative correlations, right? But of course, don't forget, you have about 15 minutes or less to do this, depending on how late the news breaks. And you're going to do it all over again when new news comes out and another starting lineup comes out or another player gets ruled out. And trust me, or if you have played NBA DFS before, you know it will. This is why most people don't even bother to late swap an NBA. And those that do are probably not doing it the right way. Because at the end of the day, it is really hard. You have to deal with a lot of information coming at you very quickly, and you have to react to all that information correctly and then rebuild your lineups in the right way. So what is really the right way then here? It is, of course, to late swap with SaberSim. The reason why is because when news breaks, we immediately start re-simulating the game to figure out what this new game situation and texture looks like. And I'm not just talking about here like redoing our projections or reassigning minutes or usage even, right? We are literally re-simulating the game play by play thousands of times and writing the new sets of thousands of game scripts along with the full ranges of outcomes and correlations for players that go along with it. So again, if you want more detail about how that simulator works, I recommend checking out that video. It's called How Our NBA Simulator Works. We recorded it yesterday. It's up on YouTube now. But this is huge. This is automating a ton of this busy work for you of understanding how a game has changed when news breaks. And this all happens in just a couple minutes. Every time we get news that changes a game, the sim will start typically 60 seconds or less after the news breaks, and it will be completed just another minute after that. And you are ready to roll. We have a fully new understanding of what the game looks like now that the news has broken. But even better, our late swapper tool, the tool that actually rebuilds the lineups, is the only tool that is available that actually knows what to do with this valuable information. And it will quickly rebuild and late swap your lineups while making sure they are still correlated and have high upside, right? Even if you could immediately just know what the new correlations and ranges of outcomes look like for players, or even if you just have average projections that update as soon as news breaks, a lot of times there's not really a tool that knows what to do with that information without you having to go in and set new player groups and change your exposures and do all this stuff like that. You don't have to do that here. So because of how easy we make this, you can effectively late swap anytime after news breaks, after lock, in literally just a couple minutes and capitalize on this massive edge that late swap provides in NBA. And sometimes this doesn't even come in the form of like one big, huge bombshell piece of news coming out. Sometimes this is tiny little changes where, maybe a player that typically comes off the bench is getting a spot start. Nobody's been ruled out, but this guy's going to play an extra 6 minutes. And then on another team, we find out that a player is limited and he's dealing with an injury, so he's only going to play 20 minutes. And all these little micro edges add up over the course of a slate, and you are late swapping to update your lineups every single time. You're adding up all these micro edges into a big edge that you have on the field in that slate. So anyway, we did something cool for this time. I know we did a similar NFL late swap video we did a similar late swap video for NFL. The challenge of talking about late swap here at 2 p.m. Eastern every single time we do this is that there's not really ever a slate to late swap, right? It's the middle of the day. I can walk through and kind of go through the motions of doing a late swap here, but we can't actually late swap any lineups here right now. There's no slate in progress. But what we did is we had Max actually record his live late swap process for last night's NBA slate using SaberSim. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that video here in just a moment. It'll be Max basically talking through what prompted him to do a late swap, what kind of contextually happened that made him want to swap. He'll walk through his actual process and talk about a few other things that he likes to think about with late swaps. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that video up. We'll watch that here, and then we will be right back. So let me go ahead and get this up here for you guys.
So hello, everybody. This is Max Steinberg. I'm a partner at SaberSim, and I'm also a daily fantasy professional. And I wanted to tell you about SaberSim's late swap feature and actually show you basically just what I do and how I use the late swap feature so you can get a sense of how you might use it, right? So let's just think for a second. Why is a late swap important? Well, late swap is important because with the NBA, there's a lot of late news that happens after your lineups lock. And because of that, we really want to be able to tinker with our lineups, especially if we're managing a lot of lineups, let's say 20 or 50, or you're maxing out tournaments, right? If you have that many lineups to manage, processing all that late news is going to be really difficult on your own. You need a tool that's going to help you, right? And especially on these big slates, like tonight is actually an 11 game slate, I'm pretty sure. You want to be able to process it quickly, get that late swap in, and that's going to increase your edge a lot, right? So basically, late swapping with SaberSim, I'm going to explain why in a little bit, is actually really useful, even if there's not much to work off of, right? And if there's not much that's changed, even if a little has changed, you might actually still want to late swap given the opportunity, because it's going to improve your lineups a little bit, and that little edge can pile up and turn your lineups even more profitable, right? So let's think about what's going on, right? So there's two ways that I usually process the news that's going on. One is through SaberSim Slack channel, where we're going to show you these Fantasy Labs alerts. But there's also another way you can do, which I like to use actually, which is this basketball monster page that I'm going to show you in 1 second. It's this news page that you can actually just find on their homepage by clicking this. It's completely free. And they have this nice little news feed, right, that's going to show you relevant news. And we've had a lot of it, right? We had these Minnesota players were announced in. We've had starters that were announced in. We saw that Jalen Suggs is going to come off the bench. Lauri Markkanen is starting at small forward. Isaac Okoro is coming off the bench. So there's like a lot of stuff to process, right? So let's just, first of all, I'm just going to show you is SaberSim is going to just process this all for you, right? If you just click this update projection icon, we're going to take all the news that has come out and we've processed. We're going to update all the projections for you, right? So if you look at this last updated button, it means that 436, we did all the updates that we saw fit, processed all the news just like you're seeing on these feeds, and updated projections, right? So we're handling this all for you, right? And that's going to really help, because what you're going to do is you're going to late swap, and it's going to build you more lineups with more accurate projections. That's going to be really good, right? But you also might want to use this to sort of focus on some teams and sort of look over some stuff, right? And this is going to be especially important with really late news, like news that happened 6 minutes ago that we might not have processed, right? So if we look at Houston, right? So let's filter for them. We have Eric Gordon coming off the bench, and you can see by these status marks that you can see that we have in fact processed this news. We have Jae'Sean Tate starting, Eric Gordon coming off the bench, and we've had the minutes accordingly. So if you have any opinions on the situation, you can actually just make adjustments if you want. Maybe you could raise or lower Aaron Gordon, or raise someone who's a starter. Do whatever you want. There's nothing I see fit in this situation. But then you're just going to look at other stuff too, right? One thing that's really interesting is Jalen Suggs, right? He's likely coming off of the bench, recovering from an illness. You can look on Twitter and see, okay, what's the deal here? And so you might want to look at him. I get the impression that he actually could play quite a bit of minutes. I know he's coming off the bench, and that sounds scary, but he's someone that I'm not going to feel that low on. And you can actually see something to clarify here is if you adjust someone's projection, we're actually not going to update it with the SaberSim projection, right? This is so you can keep your projection adjustments intact without, like worrying about what we do, right? But so what you want to do here is definitely redo this projection adjustment to make sure it's matched with us, or at least it's in line with what you want. But for me, after doing some research on Twitter, I'm thinking, you know what? I actually don't think he's going to be as limited as people think, right? So I might adjust him a little up, or at least I'm adding a little value. Going to adjust someone like Cole Anthony and Gary Harris a little down. And now we've made some adjustments that are going to help even more, right? And so you're just going to want to do this with as many people as you see fit, and just make sure that we have all of these adjustments here, and then maybe just make your own depending on what you think of the situation, right? There's multiple ways to add value here. So once you've done all that, we make it really, really easy. You just go to the entry editor on this little page, and we're going to my entries. And there's two ways to sort of handle this, right? Sometimes you're going to get late news where someone's out that was unexpected. And if you want to deal with that really fast, you can use this quick swap button, and we'll just get those players out as fast as possible and put the best available player in. But if you want to use the late swap, which we're going to talk about here, which you're going to want to use, you now can just press the late swap button, right? So this is going to work basically exactly how we built lineups for you anyway, right? You're just not going to be able to actually adjust them post-build. We're going to build you the lineups you request, the lineups that you need to fill all of the lineups in the tournaments that you entered. We're going to use the same settings. You could adjust these settings if you want. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep my stacking rule, which is something that I have, which is I don't like playing more than 3 players from the same team. fine. SaberSim probably is not going to do that for me anyway, but I just like to keep that intact. You can do something like lower min salary, but you don't have to. But you really don't have to do anything else. It's just going to work exactly how building lineups works, right? So we're going to click late swap to 50 lineups. And now what SaberSim is going to do is it's just going to re-optimize my lineups based on these new projections, right? So suddenly my lineups are going to probably look a lot different. We can actually look at what they are. And we have these lineups. It's going to change some of the lineups. It might not change others, right? So we do this. It's going to keep the locked players that we have, right? If you see here, we have Chris Duarte, and I think his game has already started. So there's nothing we can do here, right? So it's going to keep this lineup and just optimize sort of around it. And it's going to build you 50 new lineups that are better for this new information that we have. Then all you have to do, download those entries. You can go to DraftKings. I'll do that right now. And we can upload those puppies in, right? So here we go, right there. And that's that. And now if we go to our lineups page, we go back to live, and they'll be all updated like we wanted, right? So it's really quick. It's really easy. And this is something that you can really do, just like continue to do as news comes in. There's going to be a lot of nights where the news is going to be really, really big, right? It's going to change basically everything. And then that makes it really important, especially in contests that I hope you're playing where, you know, people might not be late swapping as much. You can have a player that goes from like someone who's completely off the radar to one of the best plays of the slate. So when that happens, if you late swap in when that happens, it's going to increase your edge a lot. But even if that doesn't happen, again, if you just late swap every time there's pretty relevant news, what's going to end up happening is your lineups are going to basically, you know, they're going to change around, and we're going to re-optimize based on our simulations and build them the way we always build them, the way you trust. But they're just going to be a little better, and you're going to have a little better information, and you're going to have a little more of an edge. And I think it's really going to help you increase your fantasy basketball ROI. So that's it for tonight. I'm going to do this again on FanDuel, and I'll probably late swap again throughout the night. But I hope that you enjoy this and you learn something about how to use this tool and how I would use this tool. As you can see, it doesn't take that much time, and I always explain things quite a bit. So, you know, this is something that can take a few minutes. It can really help your process. So again, hope you enjoy this. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.
Anyway, not muting my mic today. There was an issue earlier this week where I had my mic muted for like 5 minutes while I was talking, but remembered to unmute it this time. So anyway, I hope that was useful, getting an opportunity to see that here, see live what Max was doing during his late swap process. Mine looks very similar. A few things I want to point out, right? There was kind of an overall process that took place in that video, and that is what I think is a very good approach for you guys to follow as well. And the first step in that process, or the steps to success of late swapping here, is to stay relatively plugged into the news. And that may be just keeping an eye on the NBA lineup alerts channel in Slack. That is why we have that alerts channel set up. That I think is the easiest way of just keeping an eye out. The nice thing is you can see when news is breaking, and you can see when sims are running as well, side by side. If sims are running, then something changed, right? Sometimes there will be news that breaks, that something comes out and there won't be a sim that runs. That means that we were already basically modeling the game, assuming that was going to happen. Nothing changed in our end, and we didn't need to rerun a sim. So the easiest way to just stay plugged in there is to keep an eye on that NBA lineup alerts channel. You can also do other research. Max pulled up that basketball monster page there. Whatever else is a more helpful tool if you follow other Twitter accounts to know when news is breaking. But ultimately, it's going to be your call when the late swap takes place. So step one, stay plugged into the news enough that you know when those late swaps should happen. Step two is kind of what I would describe as adding value. And let me actually pull up SaberSim here, just so we can get this up on the side of the screen here. And this is something that clearly Max did quite a bit of in his in his video, right? He was going through and watching when a sim would run. And let's say we get some news about Clippers Warriors later tonight at around 8 o'clock my time here. And maybe one thing that you're doing is you're looking at the Warriors minutes and the projections. And if you are researching coaches' quotes or beat writers or something like that, that gives you a reason to think that maybe there's value to be added here in the projections, then great. Another way that you can add value here is by editing your max exposures. And I know there are already some questions here in YouTube chat, so we will get to those here shortly, but let me pull in at least a few of my entries for tonight. Another way to add value before you ran your late swap would be to set your max exposure. So I actually don't have any lineups in here yet. Let's quickly get some lineups in here just so we can have some exposure setting to do. But this would be a way of making sure that you weren't overexposed to any one player, or you could maintain stands you had on certain players, right? You could basically, make sure that you're still getting the leverage on the players that you want on the slate. And that's another great way to add a bit of value before you run your late swap. Both of these things, I would say, are completely optional. And I really mean that, especially when you only have so much time to do this. You are going to typically have to do this multiple times throughout the evening. Let me go ahead and get these in, so I at least have something in here, right? You're going to be late swapping all night, or at least multiple times a night. You may not be able to go in and adjust exposures every single time, right? The whole point of why I said it's very hard to late swap in general is what I'm trying to, what SaberSim allows you to avoid, right? You don't have to go in and set exposures to all these players, because the exposure you're getting to certain guys after you late swap is going to be appropriate for the contest. And you don't need to spend time going in and adjusting projections here in step one right before you late swap, because we've diligently put together an NBA simulator here that takes into account all these different factors. But if you have some other thoughts or a way that you want to add some value here, there's a lot of great ways to do it. And the two that I would recommend is looking at the particular team whose game situation has changed and maybe making some subtle tweaks to projections where you see fit, or setting some of these exposures to manage risk or find a bit of a leverage in the entry editor here. But finally, the last step is to basically just do it, right? And again, it's easy to think, it's easy to miss just how much of the work is being automated for you when you do this. But tonight, small slate, we're not taking into account the factors of correlation, just want pure upside. But again, even if we were, right, we would be automatically incorporating correlation, making a sharp decision on whether or not we should play or fade the chalk, and leveraging the game simulations themselves where the game scripts have been written out when we rebuild these lineups. This is not just an optimizing by projected score situation, right? We are building high upside. We are rebuilding and late swapping high upside lineups for your contest. So 3 steps: stay plugged into the news, add value optionally, right? You don't necessarily need to, and a lot of times I don't. And third, to do it, to accomplish the late swap and to do it again when new news breaks, right? Adding those 3 things together is going to give you a massive edge on the field in your NBA DFS lineups. Guys, I really mean that. This is the equivalent of stacking in baseball or football, right? This is how fundamental this is. But this, compared to something like stacking in baseball or football, where the field is getting pretty sharp and pretty much everybody's doing it, the field hasn't adjusted to this. People don't realize how important it is, and they're not doing it very much, especially at the lower to medium stakes. So you can really just get an enormous edge doing this every single day. So highly recommend that. I see real quick, I'm going to jump into questions here and start answering some of the questions you guys have. But I think I'm not seeing new comments on my YouTube feed here. So I'm going to quickly refresh. I may blip off for just a second. I will be right back. Okay, cool. So I see questions here now. We'll go ahead and start answering these here. We'll roughly handle things in the order they come in here. So we had a few questions right off the bat from Casey Franks in YouTube chat. So let me go ahead and pull SaberSim back up here so we can get that and talk about these questions. So Casey said, you may answer it throughout the video, but last night I tried to use the late swap for the first time. I ran the swap once. It worked, but I wanted to adjust the ownership. And so lower the ownership on a player I didn't want. And then the lineups that were made didn't have the players that were already playing and were no longer viable. They were just new optimal lineups. Can you only use late swap once, and and have to use the new late swap lineups, or am I just doing something wrong when I'm trying to adjust the ownership of the players in my lineup after late swapping? So a couple things. First of all, you mentioned ownership here, but it sounds to me like you're talking about exposure. But just to note a couple things that are like worth mentioning here. This ownership column is our projected ownership for how much the player is going to be owned in the entire contest, right? It is not your overall exposure to that player in your lineups. This is how many lineups you have with a certain player. So if you, for example, there's two different ways to do this, right? Which is why I'm a little bit confused and just want to touch on both. Let's say, for example, that after the early games started, ownership on some of the point guards playing in the early games was a lot lower than you expected, which made you think that Stephen Curry was going to be very chalky in the late game, right? If you updated this to like 45, for example, that would be the new projected ownership value that gets processed by the ownership fade slider when you late swap, right? The other option is setting a maximum or minimum exposure, which is controlling what percentage of lineups you get with that player in your lineup. So if you then, let's say you only wanted maximum 30% of Curry playing in the late game, if you put 30% here and then late swap, we are going to try to keep your total percentage overall of lineups with Curry under 30%. Now, two things to note. One is that when you run an actual build, we've built 500 or 1,500 different lineups. And for the most part, we can absolutely match your exact exposures you put in here. So you see, I'm asking for 47 lineups, but I have a pool of 500. And if I say I only want 50% Giannis and I want minimum, maybe there's some leverage situation here, 75% Middleton, and I want maximum 30% Kennard, right? We're going to meet these exposures pretty much exactly because we have all these extra lineups to swap in and out and do that with. In the entry editor, when you late swap, we are going to typically treat these exposures more as like guidelines of trying to get close here. And the more of these that you put in, the less likely we are going to reach these exactly. So if you just have one, right? Like, let's say, hold on. If you just put one of these in, and say like one thing, I just want to make sure I'm not over the field on Curry, right? We'll typically be able to meet that pretty easily. But if you put a ton of these in, a ton of different min and max exposures, and you've only got 50 or so lineups and you're rebuilding them all, it's possible that we'll be close to what you have as your min or max exposures, if not being exactly there. Now, in terms of the issue it sounds like you had here, Casey, what it probably sounds like if you were late swapping in lineups that swapped out players that were already playing, I would say a few things. So the first of all is make sure that you are actually using late swap here. So there's this big message here at the top, late swap, to indicate that this is a late swap build. You get to it through the swap button. I have even made the mistake, and I think I actually just did it demoing this just now, but I have made the mistake sometimes of being on this entry editor page, but pressing this button, which is actually going to start a brand new build for you. So make sure that you are actually going in and selecting late swap and going in here and doing that. Secondly, if you leave your entry editor up all night throughout the slate, so let's say you get your entries in at lock, and then you go and you sit on the couch and you start watching the basketball games, and then you come back here later and just immediately press swap, right? I would recommend you're pressing the update projections button in between that, which is going to refresh everything. It's going to refresh the projections, but it's also going to remind SaberSim of what games have started. So if you don't press the refresh button and you literally don't touch the page at all, it might still think that the early games haven't started yet. So you press this, it'll get back in line with actually the real time it is, and avoid doing that again. Finally, the third thing I would recommend is if you are still having issues, what sometimes happens, and especially if you're getting errors on your upload, is it's sometimes easy to get out of sync with the lineups that you actually have entered on DraftKings and the lineups that the entry editor thinks you have, right? Maybe, I don't know, maybe you ran your build and you put your lineups into DraftKings, and then you actually went in and ran another build after and were playing around and putting some other lineups in, or you late swapped something and somehow there's a disconnect there. You can always kind of start fresh. And what I always recommend people that are just having issues in general with the late swap do is start fresh by clicking this upload new entries button and starting over. So if I click this now and click download template file from DraftKings, it will pull the lineups in I have on TK. In this case, they're going to be the exact same, but I can kind of start over totally fresh, here, it's going to say, are you sure you want to overwrite? Yes, I do. And I can just kind of start over. And I know from this point now, what I'm showing here is literally exactly what I just downloaded from DK. So I'm all set. Now I can go forward and late swap and go on from there. So hopefully that helps. Again, a few things that I would check is just make sure that you're actually swapping with the late swap button. I've made that mistake before using the new build button on accident. Second, make sure that you've refreshed and the app is refreshed. And third, if you're ever just stuck, make sure that you are starting over with a new entries file from DK. So cool. There was a question from Jim here. Does optimizing by ceiling for GPP make any difference? So let me say this. So I assume optimizing for ceiling, what you're referring to probably is setting the percentile in step 3, right? So in step 3, you're going to see all these average projections, but we do have an option to say, show me what lineups look like at the 95th percentile, right? And it's going to change all the projections up, and we're going to see everybody having the score that they meet or exceed only 5% of the time. And the answer is that this isn't going to really have a huge impact on your lineups. There's a couple of reasons why. One is because we already incorporate a ton of upside into your lineups via the sim variance slider. So what the sim variance slider is doing is, especially at 10, it's using single game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build each lineup. So every lineup is already built with the upside of these big ceiling games because we're using game simulations and putting players into the lineup that had those big ceiling games in those game sims, right? So these lineups already have a ton of upside naturally using the sim variance slider. The second reason why, though, and in particular for NBA, why this has less of an impact, is that players are roughly normally distributed, which means their curve generally looks kind of like a bell curve. And it means that using their player's average and kind of the variance of the player overall, you can pretty accurately predict what a 95th percentile outcome looks like for a player. And I guess let me put it another way. A player, it's less likely in NBA that a player is much more likely to have a 95th percentile advantage over another player that they don't already have that same advantage on their mean projection, right? So there will be some difference here, but you will see even in our exposures that there won't be an enormous difference between player exposures switching between these percentiles for basketball. So okay, Jim said I don't mean for NBA, I mean for NFL. I don't play NBA. Okay, so for NFL, you will switching to like a 95th percentile. Still, you don't need to do that. You're still getting enough upside automatically just because sim variance is high for most NFL contests. But you will actually get a little bit of a difference here because players are not so normally distributed in NFL. And the impact will be you will squeeze out a tiny bit more of additional upside, turning it up at the expense of average performance. Your lineups will probably be a little bit less likely to min cash and maybe potentially have a little bit more high upside at the top end. So cool. I'm going to keep rolling here and get to some other questions. This one came in from Guy Will Gamble here in Slack. And he said, when you late swap for small changes, do you use min exposures to players where you were taking stands on to preserve those stances when running late swaps, assuming a minutes adjustment versus someone important getting ruled out? Yeah, this is a really good question. So for me personally, I'm going to answer this question first from how I personally approach NBA, and then I'll talk about maybe how it would look for somebody else. I really don't mess with exposures that much in NBA. And my thinking is typically that, the main thing that is going to control how many players are in your pool and how much exposure you have to each player in your pool is the sim variance slider. And this slider has been back tested for the specific contest that you tell us you're playing by building thousands of lineups at every single individual combination of sliders and figuring out which slider combination has the highest expected value lineups, right? So I feel very confident in where the sim variance slider is placed and overall very trusting in it. I mentioned here at the start of the stream that part of the challenge of NBA is that like a human being typically can't deal with solving the problem of how a team or a game has changed when news breaks and they only have 10 or 15 minutes to do it very quickly. So on an NFL slate, I'll typically sit down 2 hours before lock and I'll start looking at the slate and tweaking things and figuring out where I'm going to get my leverage and where I'm going to get my exposure. And I will make a bunch of adjustments overall to NFL because I know that most of the time there's not going to be breaking news that comes in and completely changes the way the whole slate looks at lock, right? In NBA, it's the opposite. There can totally be, the slate can change completely in the last 30, 20, 15 minutes before lock or after lock in the form of late swap. So even if I were to go in and say my stand on tonight's slate is to be underweight on Giannis, right? Let's say even with the field on Giannis and I'm going over on Middleton, right? Which actually already kind of happens here by default. That's my stand. And I'm adjusting the exposures to get there, right? If news broke that maybe before the Bucks game starts, we get news that Draymond Green is out for Golden State or something like that, right? Suddenly then I'm like, is Curry the best play on the slate? Or is, I don't know who else is on this roster. Is Wiggins the best play on the slate? Like, does it still make sense to be underweight on Giannis and overweight on Middleton when I can just play some of these guys that have now showed up in Golden State and I have 8 minutes to make this decision, right? It's very hard to decide if the leverage play still makes sense the same way it did at lock. So for that reason in particular, I don't set a lot of exposure changes here when I'm playing NBA. Like, just to be completely frank, I leave things pretty much where they are. And then when I late swap, it makes it very easy to just kind of say, Jesus, take the wheel and late swap and rebuild with the most up-to-date information and just get the new exposures that make sense. Let SaberSim solve the problem. Let the computer, the calculator that is better equipped to do it, solve the problem of figuring out, now that the situation has changed, what the best plays on the slate are and where the best plays to get exposure are. Now, that's just me personally. If you are going to go in and spend some time editing exposures before lock, right? And especially if big news hasn't come out, I think this is a sharp point from this user here. Like, let's assume it's just minor news. It doesn't dramatically change the way we're thinking about the slate, just maybe a small minutes adjustment, right? Would you use min exposures to make sure you preserve some of those stands? You definitely can. There's a couple ways to do that. First of all, the easiest way would be to just, look at your entries here and just kind of figure out, like, where are my stands? Who am I most exposed to? Do I want to be this exposed to certain players? If you wanted, maybe, okay, so let's say that we do want to preserve the Giannis fade, right? Maybe in that case, we just make sure that no matter what, we're not getting more than 35% Giannis and we are getting at least 60% Middleton. And maybe that's the one thing that we just want to preserve. I think it's totally fine to set those exposures here. The one thing to note is that if you fill your entries with a certain build that has exposures already set, those should automatically get ported over to the entry editor. So for example, we have this here. Let's say, again, our stand is fading Giannis and playing Middleton. Let's say we lock Middleton just for fun, right? If we hit save and then we go over here and we fill this with our... Oh, it actually seems like it just ported over automatically because it's already tied to that build. But we can also just fill it here, right? So it's going to bring these over here for us automatically. So that's another useful thing to note, is if you have spent some time dialing in your exposures here, you can get them to just kind of automatically go over to the entry editor by filling your entries with that particular build. Now, if you're filling entries with different builds, it's only going to do the most latest one, and that's where you have to be a little careful. So if I did a build that was for all my single entries and 3 maxes and a separate build for my 20 maxes, and I filled those separately, right? All the exposures are going to update to whatever they were set at on the build that was most recently used to fill lineups. So just be careful there. But in general, yes, I guess for this question, like just thinking from a theoretical standpoint, if it feels like it's just a small change, right? You've done some research. It doesn't seem like big breaking news has come out, but a sim has run and maybe minutes were slightly shifted around. I think it's totally fine to just preserve your stands on the slate by setting min and max exposures here. But be careful, I would say, on where you decide to draw that line. Sometimes news is bigger than it might seem. So anyway. All right, cool. Let's go ahead and hit some more of these questions here. Aaron said, this is why I love single entry in NBA because of late swap. Yeah, I've heard that a lot before. I will say, I think SaberSim makes it about as easy as it possibly can to late swap for multi-entry. But if you want a ton of control, a ton of control over what your lineup actually looks like for each individual lock, it's probably a little bit easier to play less lineups. So Jim said, how's Saber for NHL? I'm getting it. Hate NBA. Saber's great for NHL. We are planning on doing a NHL strategy session next week, so stay tuned for that. We'll be talking about NHL strategy. I know there's a few people out there playing hockey for the first time. It is a high variance, highly correlated sport where chalk is typically kind of bad, making it like the perfect storm for SaberSim. I think plays very similarly to baseball, so definitely worth checking out. Smaller DFS sport overall, sometimes harder to get the best contests for NHL, but definitely a sport that the model does very well. So, John said, when building multiple lineups for a GPP, what's a good rule of thumb as far as player exposure percentage? Yeah, so it's going to depend a lot on the slate and the contest that you are playing, right? How much exposure you get to any one player and how many players are in your pool is going to be most heavily determined by the sim variance slider that I've talked about here a bit. And that's going to change based on what you tell us you're playing. If you're playing a 500 person 3-max, right, you are going to have probably some locks, some 100% owned players in your set of 3 lineups. If you are playing a 150,000 person 150 max, right, you are probably going to, even on a 3-game slate, have probably no players that are 100% owned and a lot more spread out exposures overall, a lot more diverse lineups. That's one of the things that I think is another really strong feature of SaberSim is that you don't have to make the decisions of how much exposure is appropriate for your plays, right? We are building you a pool that makes sense by default. From there, though, you can kind of dial in and manage your risk using the exposure settings in step 3. And I think the easiest way to visualize that or think about where the right spots to do that are with this leverage column. So the leverage column is basically just going to take your exposure to a player and subtract the projected ownership. And it will show you quickly what your biggest stands, what your biggest plays on the slate are, and also what your biggest fades on the slate are. And this is a very good way to make sure that nothing is necessarily out of line. One thing that I always like to look for, again, for NBA, I frankly just don't care too much about this because I know I'm going to be late swapping anyway. But for something like NFL, this might be a bit of a flag to me where I am almost twice as exposed to Giannis as any other player from the standpoint of leverage on the slate. And maybe I don't need that much leverage to still be well over the field on him. Sometimes I will do something like just knocking this down a bit to bring my leverage overall into line with some of the other plays. But again, a lot of these decisions are kind of handled for you here automatically. So Chris said that download new lineups and open DraftKings thing never works for me. I run specifically on Android mobile. I always get lineups invalid at message. So I always have to go back to my entries in SaberSim and manually input the 2 dropdowns, then download, save, and upload into DK. Okay, so I do think there is a small bug on mobile at the moment that we will have fixed ASAP, where the download button on the late swap build itself doesn't actually download an entries file. So if you click late swap, for example, and run the build and then download that file from there, that file should just be an entries file that's ready to go that can be uploaded. And right now on mobile only, it is downloading as just a lineups file. That is causing some problems. So I think, Chris, that is actually just legitimately a bug, and we are working on getting that fixed ASAP. So sorry about that. Chris also said, is there a way to have your max exposures set to players in step 3 transfer over into the late swap? For example, last night, step 3, I put Dinwiddie max 30, then late swap now getting 70% Dinwiddie. Yeah, so you should be able to do that kind of the way I mentioned here just before. So I think this question probably just came in right before I talked about that last one. I think the easiest way to do this, if you just like really want to kind of, I think the easiest way to do this here is to just fill your contest with the build that has the exposures in it, right? So if you have some exposures already in here, right? Like let's say you have some stuff in here. That button isn't working, but I'll take a look at that too. Anyway, the exposures get ported over with the build information. So again, if we move this over, we'll port over the min and max exposures that you have set from the build you just used to fill from that build. So cool. Let's see. I'm going to jump over and get this question from Zach that came in on Slack here real quick. And he said, hang on. This message is not sending here. Oh, okay. There we go. Zach said, if we are in a 150 max and a 20 max contest, do we need to do 2 separate late swap builds, or can we late swap both contests within the same build? You literally can late swap these together. So like you can group all your contests together and just run your late swap. Like the tool is built to handle that well. From the strategy standpoint of like, should I late swap my 150 maxes and 20 maxes and single entries all together? I typically just do for basketball in particular. I don't think the time of going through and setting these independently to different, like say I wanted to do just my 3 maxes and single entries, right? For the same reason that I typically group everything together when I actually do the build, I also typically just late swap everything together. I think it's just way easier. And again, since I'm going to be doing it over and over again for every single lock that night, I don't want to late swap 2 or 3 different times every lock. I just want to late swap once. So that is what I typically do. I think the value you are adding by late swapping at all completely outweighs anything you are sacrificing by not completely optimally late swapping your single entries versus your 20 maxes versus your 150 maxes. So Mike asked a good question. Any chance you could go over contest selection for NBA? I don't play much, but I plan to. I've mostly been doing single entry GPP. So our general contest selection principles still stand for NBA. They are, first of all, play 5% or less of your bankroll on any given slate. Avoid playing more than 0.5% of your bankroll in any single given lineup. Play as many lineups as you can in the lowest dollar entry contest possible before moving up in stakes. Looking for contests that are over 1,000 effective entrants, so total number of entries divided by the entry limit, and under $3 if you have access to those contests. Those are the fundamentals. The video that breaks this down in way more detail is on our YouTube site. It is on our YouTube. It is for NFL in particular, but the principles work the same way for other sports. So it is actually now, okay, so it is a little bit back. So you have to click on strategy sessions here on YouTube and go to how to double your NFL DFS ROI in 15 minutes. So this is like our original video that breaks down all of our contest selection principles and talks about why we prioritize the contests we do. Again, this is for NFL, but the principles still apply. For NBA in particular, I am planning on recording a follow-up video to that video. I think actually hopefully by tomorrow, walking through the DraftKings and FanDuel lobby, talking about my favorite contests overall to play based on those principles. NBA, I think, is probably the second biggest DFS sport at the moment. So there are pretty good contests overall. There aren't as many good ones as NFL, but there's a lot of good ones. So I want to record a video talking about what I think are the best contests to play overall. So Mike followed that up by saying, would you recommend double ups? I'm comfortable risking $1,500 to $2,000 per slate, depending on the size. Day like today, I'll go light. Yeah, so I did do another strategy session recently called How to Beat NBA Cash Games. In this video, I talk about my cash game strategy and when I think it makes sense to start playing some cash games. If you are risking $1,500 to $2,000 a slate, I think you are going to qualify as somebody that it makes sense after you've played all of the best GPPs to get some cash in there, because the cash contest that will be available to you will be better than the remaining GPPs once you've filled up even probably like $500 worth of volume. So again, I will record a video. Again, I'm hoping to do this by tomorrow and get a video out that has a full contest selection breakdown of how I recommend picking the best contest for NBA. So cool. Okay. Don said, Jordan, do you play NBA Showdowns? If so, how do you feel your results have been? I haven't had a chance to dive into NBA Showdown too much this season. We also did a strategy session specifically for Showdowns. So if you're interested in Showdowns, highly recommend checking this out. 3 secrets to beating NBA Showdowns here. I think we have a huge edge using SaberSim for Showdown, again, because we are actually writing game scripts for games, right? We understand what the actual game flows of these games, the play-by-play impact of these games plays out, how important the context of the score and the time remaining on the clock and who's on the court and all these things impact who actually gets to play and who has upside, right? So I think there's a big edge there. I just haven't had a chance really to dive in. As you can imagine, busy start of the season here for us. So I've been playing mostly the main slates, just trying to get a lot of action there, but I will probably dabble a little bit in Showdown this year, at the very least by the playoff time. I think that's typically when I have the most fun with Showdowns. When I play most of them, I will dive into Showdowns a little bit there. So Jim said, is there a way to set max ownership for lineups? There is not. We've talked about adding something like that, or at least a filter or a sort in step 3 to remove lineups with a certain ownership sum. We feel in general that our approach to ownership with the ownership fade slider is way better than an ownership sum cap. An ownership sum cap gives you very little information about the overall ownership context of a lineup. It's not a very descriptive way of explaining how often a lineup is going to be duplicated. And it also doesn't really deal with the individual variance of a player to determine if chalk is good or bad. It's just a very blunt tool. The ownership fade slider compares the variance of the player to their projected ownership and to the average ownership of the position, and then makes a determination if that player makes sense to fit into the lineups. So I think it is a much better approach. If you think your lineups are getting too chalky, I recommend starting with just turning the ownership fade slider up. Kyle said, hello, just signed up with SaberSim. I have a beginner question. Should I use my single entry GPP lineups in my head-to-head matches? I would not. For head-to-heads, you want to be building a cash lineup, which is typically just a optimal projected lineup based on projections. So the easiest way to build a cash lineup that you would use in head-to-heads is to go into the new build button and click style and click cash. This is going to turn the impacts of correlation and ownership fade and our sims off and just build you the best overall projected lineups we can for this slate. These are the lineups I would use in all of your head-to-heads rather than using a single entry GPP lineup. A single entry GPP is going to value playing lower ownership lineups, lower ownership players. It's going to value correlation a bit. It's not going to give you the best overall projected lineup we can. So you're going to be giving up a little bit there in terms of raw value. So I recommend going this route. If you are interested in playing more cash, I recommend checking out this video. Again, it's on our YouTube channel under strategy sessions, how to beat NBA cash games. I talk a lot more about cash game strategy. So John said, being a novice in this whole DFS thing, wouldn't me tinkering with the SaberSim projections just screw things up for me? Even as somebody that isn't a novice, I typically leave most of the projections alone. And I think that is totally fine. I think there are places to add value to projections if you are doing a lot of research and looking into things that are difficult to project, like coaches' quotes and beat writers and new situations. But you by no means do you have to. And if you don't feel like you know what to do with the projections, I would just leave them alone. I leave them alone on 95% of slates. I like to add a lot of my value instead here on step 3 by just dialing in my exposures to be where I want them to be. So all right. That is all I have for questions here. I hope this was helpful for you guys today. Again, late swapping is absolutely crucial in NBA DFS. It's not just about swapping to get a player that is not playing anymore out of your lineups. It is about swapping every time news breaks so that you can update to the most latest projections and correlations and ranges of outcomes and building the highest upside lineups possible. Most people aren't doing this, and a lot of the people that aren't doing it right because it's really hard. Updating your information to have the new projections and correlations and ranges of outcomes every time news breaks in 15 minutes or less, and then rebuilding your lineups to account for that is just brutal. And it's really hard to do slate after slate and night after night. SaberSim makes it easier than any other tool out there. And you will get a huge edge on your NBA DFS competition this year by late swapping every single slate anytime news is breaking. You don't have to take my word for it. If you haven't already tried us out, you can get a free trial at SaberSim.com by clicking the big green button that says Start My Free Trial. We reset everybody's trial at the start of the NBA season. So even if you have tried us in the past and you left at some point, you can come back now, get a totally free 7 days, no strings attached, and check us back out. We did a full visual redesign to the app in the last couple months. We pushed out a bunch of new features. The model has been really pumped up and really upgraded for this particular season, the simulator. So we're super excited about this season. Come check us out. Get your free 7 days. Play some NBA through the rest of the week. Play a little NFL on Sunday, maybe. You'll get access to all sports for 7 days. So if you have any other questions about NBA late swap strategy or anything else, always feel free to email us at support@sabersim.com. And we will be back here again for a stream again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. I think just open Q&A office hours tomorrow. So any questions you have about NBA or NFL or anything else, come ask me here again tomorrow. Until then, enjoy the little 3-gamer NBA slate tonight. Enjoy Thursday Night Football if you're playing that. And I will talk to you guys tomorrow. See ya.